Today I'll be talking about, to follow up on the previous speakers who started talking about various approaches of soft power, but I'll address it from the perspective of sustainability in general, and I'll use the SDGs as one of the examples. But basically, when we talk about, and I'm glad that the previous speaker, and it's pretty much related to it because the World Bank also is very engaged in terms of SDGs implementation. And one of the action areas, of course, is education. And in fact, one of the SDGs is quality education. But quality, it has various aspects. Among them is the content that you provide and how does that content actually meet the industry needs and contribute to achieving development goals. So if you look at broadly what's happening at the global level, I know the sessions today are focused, and this forum is focused on technology, on EDTECH, but there are various, we live in a very fast-changing global world with various changes that are impacting the global economic and financial landscape. And these are just some of the key examples on which the world is focusing now, or we see various initiatives. We have, of course, the prudential regulations like Basel III. We have the Bitcoin. We're talking now about ICOs in addition to IPOs. Climate change, which is impacting basically the well-being of humans and which needs global mobilization. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are various fintech initiatives, and we've seen quite a few examples in the past 2 days here in IFC. The concepts of sharing economy, circular economy, ESG, environmental, social, and governance objectives that are being embedded in financial transactions, for example, or screening certain investments. Socially responsible investment. And of course, we have more and more cross-border transactions, namely because of the various collaborations we have. And basically, when you have big projects, some of them are co-funded, and you have, of course, maybe multilateral development banks participating, other countries, other funds, banks, and other financial institutions. And this requires a different approach in and various skills, of course, that are required today. So defining core competencies is critical to achieve sustainability today. And if we look at the SDGs, there are 17, of course, SDGs, as you know, and there are under the 17 SDGs, you have 169 targets, and each of them has various action plan or things that need to be done respectively by governments and to be integrated in their national development plans. Of course, as I mentioned, you have quality education as one of the objectives. You have also gender equality, you have climate change. Perhaps a lot of discussions are focused today on climate change simply because it does impact most of these objectives, for example. So today, if you look at the economic implications of climate change, they are significant, that cannot be ignored by governments. I think more than 170 countries ratified the Paris Agreement, and that requires mobilization to achieve the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. And of course, the target to achieving these SDGs is 2030, which is quite ambitious. And the implementation strategies will vary between developing countries and developed countries, etc. So only to achieve those SDGs, there is about a 2 to 3 billion US dollar gap, investment gap every year that is required. And therefore, most of the initiatives now are focused on attracting the private sector and incentivizing the private sector to contribute to achieving or financing developments that fall under the SDG agenda. Now, if we look at, I'm sorry, the title is not clear, but this is basically the 3 key components of sustainable development. And I would add on that the governance issues. So you have the economic aspect, the social aspect, the environmental aspect, and then, of course, you have the governance, the overall governance objectives. And if you look at this descriptions and what's in common, for example, achieving economic and social, you have socioeconomic objectives, of course, you have socio-environmental objectives, and of course, we're talking about eco-efficiency, etc. Especially when we're talking about environmental objectives, a lot of discussions now are focused, for example, on renewable energy, and a lot of countries have ambitious targets to achieve transition to renewable energy. Like some developed countries have 100% objective, some have 20, 30, 50%, depending on their current stage in terms of renewable energies implementation. The reason why I'm basically discussing first about all these global challenges is that to achieve these challenges, you have to have the right human capital in place. So from all these challenges, you have various skills that are required, and these skills are different than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, will be different than the skills needed in 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think there was one interesting discussion this morning about some of the jobs that will disappear in 10 years' time. 10 years' time, maybe my job as professor, we have MOOCs now. So this is very important to consider now when developing educational programs and curricula at universities. And when we look at basically what does it mean considering sustainability or in curricula, simply that require a behavior change in terms of research, in terms of competencies. You have in the way you engage the various stakeholders. You need to talk more about ethics, responsibilities, and then the complexities that need to be integrated for transformative actions among students. Now, this is pretty much what, like the approach I would like to discuss today, and this is what we are actually implementing at HBKU. I come from the Islamic finance programs, but we're trying also to address these objectives within the framework of the basically the ethical principles of Islamic finance. And today, when we talk about the SDGs, there's also mobilization at the global level to transit from a linear economy to a circular economy, and basically, which has environmental objectives. The ideas, of course, you've heard about recycling, waste management, resources optimization, etc. And all these requires various skill sets, of course, depending on the disciplines. And this is why you have here a multidisciplinary approach in addressing all these challenges and embedding them in the educational programs we have today. You have to consider also social goals in the sense that you need to be social innovatives. For example, in the financial instruments, when we talk about financial engineering today, the objective is not only profit maximization. Of course, there is the objectives of profits and economic viability of projects, but in addition, you have social and environmental objectives. One of the recent transactions, I think, in the capital markets in Indonesia, basically on sukuk. Sukuk are, for those who are not familiar with the instrument, is the equivalent of bonds in the conventional industry, where basically investors can invest in a project, but you have certain KPIs under that project. If these KPIs are met, the investor has the right to waive part of his periodic profit for the benefit of that project. So that means that profit can be also reinvested, etc. So in a way, you're integrating social objectives together with, of course, economic objectives and environmental objectives in certain cases, if the project achieves or targets certain environmental objectives. And of course, transformative in the sense that you are changing the mindsets and you are integrating new emergent topics that have development implications. And very important is how do you integrate local, national, and global strategies. For example, in Qatar, I'm talking about HBKU, how do you integrate these? Of course, when we talk about global, this would be the climate change objectives, the SDGs. How do you integrate them in your respective disciplines? But also national, because every country now has a vision. For example, in Qatar, we have Qatar National Vision 2030, where there are also a set of objectives to be achieved by 2030. So how do you integrate all these strategies in your curriculums and you develop your students or the skills of your student to be prepared to contribute once to the industry when they are graduated. And here, this is what basically, if you want to talk about the skill set, what are the skills that are required? And this is mainly if you group them by themes, you would have the mindsets. You need a change in the mindsets. That's why now we have a lot of discussions on ethics in business, integrating ethical principles. In fact, it's not only Islamic finance, but in our programs, for example, we have foundational courses. And first we start by embedding ethical principles in basically explaining or discussing ethical foundations of finance. And you know that this is common also with socially responsible investing, where transactions are guided by a set of moral and ethical transactions like social justice, inclusiveness, etc. So these are very important to integrate in the curricula in general, be in business, economics, or any other discipline. Second, you need, of course, to develop a strategy. And when we talk about a strategy, you have two approaches. Either you have a top-down approach, meaning that in your pedagogy or at the institution level, you have sustainability objectives that need to be embedded. And then those goals and those objectives are declined into targets within your various programs. And I'll discuss later example from the finance and economics discipline, but the same analogy or same analysis could be done to any other discipline. And of course, this involves change management, involves innovation. Innovation also could include embedding, for example, using technology. This morning we discussed a lot of initiatives by using technology for education, but technology is the mean to have an efficient, educational processes, etc. But here I'm more talking about the content. And of course, you decline this into technical levels. As I said, the targets will vary depending on the discipline. If you're talking about finance and economics, how do you embed sustainability objectives in, for example, financial engineering, in reporting, in accounting, in management, in leadership? If you have the same analogy, for example, when you talk about let's say engineering, science and engineering, you would discuss, for example, about sustainable cities. You will discuss about architecture. How do you integrate sustainability objectives in architecture design? We're talking, for example, about green buildings. In waste management, we're talking about green landscapes and green cities, etc. So the same analysis could be used in various disciplines. Now, from the perspective of finance and economics, as I mentioned, what the diagram you see on the left side is basically, this is from the UNDP, and it discussed the various actions that are required to embed sustainability in the financial sector. So you can see it's quite challenging. There are many objectives and many concerned, basically, third parties or stakeholders. And to talk about it from a more practical perspective, I'm not sure if there are students here or from the finance and economics disciplines. As I mentioned, you need to start with the ethical foundations, okay? And these are the ethical principles that need to be used when, for example, structuring a financial transaction, when designing a new investment product. As I mentioned, the principles of socially responsible investing. How do you screen certain transactions to exclude those are unethical, for example, that are harmful to the environment? And this would also support financial innovation and engineering in designing more products and instruments that can be used to raise financing, for example, for the SDGs. So this will equip the students with new analytical tools. And we know now, for example, in the capital markets, we have socially responsible investments, we have green bonds, we have green sukuk. We have also other themed bonds like water bonds, women empowerment bond, etc. So all these are innovative tools that fall under the financial engineering. Impact assessment, transparency are very important because when you talk about development objectives, the SDGs, you need also to ensure the traceability of the various funds that you channel to develop projects and to assess if that impact or those objectives have been achieved. And therefore, there's a huge need today in business and economics programs, for example, to develop those tools. So we talk about impact assessment methodologies, third-party certifications, which are done, for example, in the West by universities, research centers in universities. with the detailed metrics by sector. For example, when you talk about waste management, what are the KPIs to be assessed? How can you assess them? And how do you report them to your investors? Similarly, when you talk about green buildings or when you talk about renewable energy, ICT, etc., so all these require specific skill set, and this could be together with, of course, experts in every area. And of course, enabling frameworks and incentives, this is more on the regulatory side. For example, I'm talking from our perspective, our students comprise both like full-time students and also practitioners. And among the practitioners, you have representatives from regulatory bodies. So you need also to discuss with them what is the enabling framework and what incentives, for example, from a tax perspective, like withholding taxes, incentives on withholding taxes, etc. Enabling framework like the appropriate frameworks and guidelines and the taxonomies, etc., to recognize what is sustainable, what is green, what is ethical. So all these considerations are important to address in our activities. So to conclude, basically, and to share with you the Hbq approach, it has 3 levels. So as I said, you need a combination of a top-down and bottom-down approaches, in the sense that there is a strategic level where you define your approach in integrating sustainability. This could be done at the institutional level, at the management level. It could be done as well at the, for example, at the Ministry of Education level. Like, these are the objectives that you need to meet, and how do you decline them into measurable targets and objectives at every institution. And from there, you have an action plan and targets under each program. It requires also the faculty professional development. So to integrate all these emerging issues, you need also to keep your faculty up to date with the recent developments, etc., and what's up. So that's why you see a lot of faculty participating, for example, in working groups with the international organizations like the UN, like the World Bank, a lot of multilateral institutions, a lot of national development funds, etc. But also you need the right resources, because when we talk, for example, about implementing, let's say, going back to impact assessment, you have also what we call sustainability rating. You have sustainability indices now that are being developed. So all these tools require tremendous resources to form your students and equip them with analytical skills. So you need the access to the right databases, the right analytical tools, etc. And that shouldn't be looked at as a burden for the university if you look at it at the long term and you look at the long-term benefits of that. And of course, the continuous monitoring and academic industry partnerships, this is very important. As I said, a lot of the recent developments that we have seen in terms of, for example, financial innovation, in terms of enabling frameworks, were done in collaboration with the industry. So you have academic institutions partnered with multilateral institutions or national institutions or regulators to develop those initiatives. And of course, as I mentioned, our approach is quite unique in the sense that we implemented recently a new PhD focused on actually those objectives. So it's on Islamic finance and economy, but among the key areas that we are basically discussing with our students, or among the key courses, are courses focused on circular economy, on social finance, basically, what is important to discuss inclusiveness issues, etc. And the other side is research, as we said, where we're trying to bridge the gap between industry and academia, beside all the side events like today's event, and of course other events engaging the industry to have common ground and discussion on those emerging topics. So this is it on from my side. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now or at the discussion.